The Dark Room with your hosts, Paul Salvatori and Jordan Randall.
Okay, so today we get the pleasure of sitting down to speak with a gentleman named Christian Picciolini.
Now, Christian Picciolini has come quite some ways. He was a neo-Nazi. He is now a peace advocate.
Hello, this is Christian.
Hi, Christian. It's Paul Salvatore. How are you?
Good, Paul. How are you?
Good. I'm here myself and my friend and co-host Jordan Randall.
Hi, Christian. Thanks for taking the time.
Hi, Jordan. My pleasure, Jordan. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
So, yeah, thank you again, Christian, for talking to us. So I'd just like to ask a little bit about your book and so how you got to where you are now. But to do just a bit of a backstory of how you first got involved with, I guess the question was simply, how did you first become involved with neo-Nazism?
Sure. Well, I was 14 years old when I had my first involvement in the movement, and it was really benign. In fact, I wasn't raised racist and certainly didn't have any kind of political leanings at 14 years old. I was simply standing in an alley, a misguided kid who felt marginalized and disenfranchised with being picked on for many, many years. And I was standing in an alley one day smoking a joint, kind of like a scene out of a movie. A 1968 Firebird came roaring down the alley that I was standing in. And out from the car came an individual who was much older than me. He was about 26 years old at the time. And when he got out of the car, he had a shaved head and tall, shiny boots. And he walked over to me and he grabbed the joint out of my mouth and he crushed it with the toe of his boot. And he said, "Don't you know that that's what the capitalists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile?" Now, I was 14 years old. I hardly knew what a capitalist was. I don't think I'd met a Jewish person at that point in my life, and didn't even really know what the word docile meant. So I was initially terrified, but I was also struck with a charisma and a power that this individual had. And as it turns out, this guy who came up to me in the alley that day was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead leader. And in fact, the neo-Nazi skinhead movement had started just across the alley from where I had spent most of my time growing up. And this was 1987, at a time when most Americans didn't know what a skinhead was. It had started in England in the 60s and had gotten politicized and quickly made its way overseas to the United States. But at first I wasn't drawn in by the politics. I was drawn in by the structure of the family atmosphere, which I was lacking in my own life. And quickly became involved and politicized and spent 7 years of my life as part of America's first neo-Nazi skinhead gang.
Mm-hmm. And 1980s, it's Chicago, correct, Christian?
Correct,
right.
The south side of Chicago.
Yeah, what was it like that? I mean, do you feel that your involvement was a result at all of you experiencing anything along the lines of racial tensions or things like that?
It was a fairly Italian neighborhood that I grew up in. Most of the folks who lived there in this small section of Blue Island, which is the name of the town on the south side of Chicago, came from the same villages in Italy. So there was always a sense of very strong Italian pride, of which I was a part of and my family was a part of. Mm-hmm. There wasn't much racial tension. However, the neighborhood was changing, and it started to be bordered by African American families and Latino families, and although I didn't see it at the time, prior to 14, crime was increasing, and that was actually one of the tools that was used by my recruiter to get me to understand that there was a white genocide going on, that the blacks were moving in to destroy us and increase crime, and that the Latinos were moving in to bring drugs in and rape our sisters and our family members. And it was that sense of fear and that fundamental ignorance that misguided me to go down a path. It was a fear tactic, and it's a very strong recruiting method when dealing with kids who are searching for answers, especially someone like me who really wanted to do something that mattered and really wanted to belong to something that was important, although I didn't know what it was at the time. When I was faced with joining this group, and I was also faced with what they told me were the problems surrounding my neighborhood and the Italian families that I was very proud of, it started to ring true to me based on what I saw happening in my neighborhood. Now, 3 weeks after I had my initial contact, I was also beaten up by a group of 3 black kids, and my bike was stolen. So that seemed to reinforce my belief that, crime was entering our neighborhood, and that if I didn't do something about it, that it would just increase and it would eventually hurt my family and the people I cared about.
Now, interesting, Christian, because I, myself, I'm Italian, and I could, of course, relate to the Italian traditions of, whether we're talking about Italian Americans or Italian Canadians. And, of course, what comes to mind with that tradition is conviviality, love, compassion. So these sorts of things that you don't normally associate with neo-Nazism or hatred.
Absolutely,
right.
And in fact, that was the case with my family as well. When they came to the United States in the mid-1960s, they were often the victims of prejudice themselves. And because of that, they were very caring about not raising me to be racist or to be judgmental or prejudiced of anybody else, because they had known firsthand the struggles of coming to the United States as immigrants. That said, there was always a sense of community, and there was always a fear of outsiders coming into the community. And while there wasn't any blatant racism or neo-Nazism that happened in the Italian community, it certainly didn't start there. At least my involvement. There was still a sense of belonging to the small community of people that had come from the same village. So outsiders were always seen, with caution.
Mm-hmm.
And when my recruiter, saw that in me, he reinforced that by pouring gasoline on the fire and saying that any outsider was there to do us harm.
Right. And I also asked the question, Christian, because I'm wondering what it was like when your family, or did they know that you were involved at that time in neo-Nazism, what the reactions were?
Yeah, I think that at first they didn't really have an idea of what I was involved in. I certainly wasn't, all that interested in letting them in on it. So for the first few years, I kept it very much under the radar. And for the first few years, I also wasn't very active in the movement. I was too young to be let into the inner circle. I wasn't privy to some of the things that they were undertaking. So I was kind of just hanging around at the time. But it didn't take long. Because after a few years of being involved, after 2 short years of being involved, my recruiter and several of the founding members of this group here in Chicago had gone to prison for a string of violent hate crimes, one which included beating a former female member who they suspected was hanging around with a black guy, and they had gone to her apartment and pistol whipped her and painted a swastika on the wall with her own blood, and they were rightfully arrested for that and prosecuted and went to prison. So there was suddenly this void left in this very infamous group that had now started to become recognized nationally as kind of the genesis of this movement, this American movement. And by this time, neo-Nazi skinheads had started to pop up in major cities all across the country, but had always looked to Chicago as kind of the genesis of this movement. So when the people who influenced me went to prison, and after having been involved for a couple of years, I suddenly, by default, became the leader of this organization, and all the folks, all the young people who had been recruited after me looked to me as their leader. So it quickly turned into something that was partially benign and misguided, and then I became intoxicated with the power that a 17-year-old kid could have leading a violent organization of people who were looked at as, looked upon as kind of the forefathers of this American movement. So my responsibility was great, and I took that into account and I ran with it. And unfortunately, it was completely misguided. But I had created somewhat of a very strong following, both locally and regionally, and then at 17 and 18 years old, started to progress nationally and internationally as well, as I started a series of white power bands, which were not very well represented in the United States, and traveled to Europe to perform concerts in front of thousands of people. So you can imagine for a 17 and an 18-year-old kid to wield that kind of power and celebrity was very intoxicating, even though sometimes the politics of the movement that I was involved in were foreign even to me, and I struggled internally with that identity. But effectively pushed down those reservations because I embraced the power and the respect that came along with it.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly want to talk about your experience in the leadership and music. But before that, Christian, a lot of what you say, for me at least, resonates or seems to reflect, a movie, a well-known movie, American History X. You having gone through it, the neo-Nazi movement, how accurate is the depiction there?
It's a Hollywood film that certainly uses some creative license, but I would say the parts where it rings very true are, the depiction of how young people are preyed upon by very savvy leaders who know what to look for in young recruits. They look, for kids who feel disenfranchised with things or who maybe don't have a very strong support structure as far as family life goes or a support network. And they prey on these young people and inject in them this misguided ideology to offer them a sense of structure and a sense of belonging. And I think that was pretty well depicted in the film, especially in the scenes of the party where, many of the skinheads were hanging out. They're typically, alcohol-fueled parties with not a whole lot of direction, a lot of infighting, and not very responsible leadership. Simply a lot of those young kids who get involved in these groups, there's a very high turnaround rate. They try to recruit as many people as possible, knowing that maybe only 20% of the people they recruit will actually end up becoming long-term true believers. And the ones who are the true believers, and also those trying to work their way up the ranks, are very inclined to commit violent acts to prove themselves. And I thought that was also pretty accurately depicted in the film. And there are lots of storylines in my life that mirror the storylines in the film, and it's my theory that the character in the film is kind of an amalgam of several real-life characters, of which my story may be part of that.
Right. In terms of the actual violence that happens within the movement, Christian, is that... how would I put this? Is that part of the protocol? Is that the expectation, or is that expectation there for the members of the group to be involved in, like you're sent out on missions or things like that? Is that normally how it works, or is it just random?
No, it's both. There certainly is a very deliberate call to action, and by action I mean violence, when members of this group come together at meetings or rallies. The music itself is made to be insightful of violence. And I say insightful with a C and not with an S, because it is meant to incite people, to get them riled up, to go out and cause damage. Another really important part of something that I helped teach as part of the movement and is also a very prevalent part of the movement today, is the concept of leaderless resistance, or a lot of your listeners may understand the term lone wolf. there was a very concerted effort to bring people into the nest, to indoctrinate them into the ideology, and then to push them out of the nest and force them to be lone wolves, to act alone so that they're not tied to an organization for several reasons. One, so it's much harder for the federal government and law enforcement to infiltrate a group if there is no group and work their way up the ranks to take down the leadership. If a person is acting alone, many times it's untraceable, or it's impossible to forecast that type of violence, as we can see in the news stories that pop up both in our country and in your country every day of people acting alone, but having been indoctrinated somewhere down the line to commit those acts of violence. But when they actually commit them, they're not really tied to an organization, and that's a very deliberate effort on the side of the movement to do that, because they know that the most damage can be caused by lone actors. So there's a combination of both. Certainly, the neo-Nazi skinhead movement is a very, very violent movement. I don't know that any neo-Nazi skinhead will tell you different. I think that they're very proud of the fact that they see themselves as white warriors who are there to protect, the white race at all costs. In fact, their mission statement is something that we used to call the 14 words, which is, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And what kind of gets appended to the end of that is, by all means necessary. So it is inherently a violent movement, although many of the folks who have branched out from the neo-Nazi skinhead movement or the KKK or a lot of the more recognizable movements have now started to make their way and infiltrate groups like the far-right Tea Party or militia groups or patriot organizations, as they call themselves in this country, or sovereign citizen groups, which outwardly are not racist organizations, but the ideologies are typically the same: to take down the government, to take down minorities, because they feel that white genocide is taking place. So while they may not be using the same rhetoric, and things like the N-word like we used to use, they're replacing those with more benign terms to become more mainstream and appeal to more people. And we're seeing that, and we also see that when our political leaders, especially our presidential candidates, kind of fan the flames of racism and Islamophobia, that we actually see more crimes, more hate crimes taking place from members who are not tied to specific groups and who are acting alone. And in fact, since 9/11, more than double of Americans have been killed on U.S. soil by white extremist groups than by any other foreign extremist or terrorist groups combined.
Wow. So you see the neo-Nazi philosophy embedded in these mainstream groups, but in veiled language and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, probably to the dismay of some of the members of those groups who, may have conservative political leanings, who aren't privy to the leadership's conversations that they're typically about race and the white race and white protection. But yeah, we've seen a lot of folks who were members of neo-Nazi groups or KKK groups infiltrating these groups and actually becoming leaders of these organizations as well.
Wow. Now, I'm curious, Christian, along the way or during your time being a neo-Nazi, did you have any non-neo-Nazi friends, people in your family that cautioned you, maybe, this is not the right thing, this is a group of hatred, violence, and how did you respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I had a lot of people during my 7 years of involvement who, certainly family members, my whole family who wasn't involved, who tried to help me, steer me away from that ideology and those actions. But, being a stubborn teenager and a violent one, I didn't really pay much attention to them. I saw them sometimes as enemies, and sometimes I saw them as obstacles. But it wasn't until I opened a record store in 1995 with the intent of selling white power music that I was importing from overseas, because this was largely before the consumer internet. People, couldn't order an MP3 or couldn't download an MP3 or order music online. They had to do it through mail order. So I had the idea, because I was an entrepreneurial spirit, that I wanted to start a record store. And I imported this white power music from overseas. And in fact, it ended up becoming 75% of my total revenue at the record store. But because I also wanted to be a good business person like my parents were, I started to sell other music like heavy metal and punk rock and ska and hip hop. And before I knew it, I started to have conversations with people who I'd alienated from my social circles. So I started to dialogue with black people for the first time, and I started to meet gay people and same-sex couples and Jewish people. And at first, my interactions were very standoffish. I bit my lip because I was still very entrenched in the ideology of the movement. But, being a business person, I knew that their money was just as green as anybody else's in a selfish way. But I started unwittingly to have conversations with these people and become very connected to them. And over time became more so connected to these people who I'd alienated than the family I had created for those 7 years. And those relationships allowed me to understand compassion because, where I came from isn't a very big town. I knew just about everybody who came into my store. And I knew that they also came there with the purpose to try and get to me. They saw something in me that was salvageable. And they made it their purpose to come in and continue to shower me with compassion and with empathy until I was able to realize and reconnect with my own empathy that I had experienced prior to 14 years old in my introduction to the movement. Mm-hmm. So, I started to become very close friends with these people who, were my enemies. And because of their show of compassion for me, I was able to find the empathy within myself again. And that was really one of the first catalysts to me leaving the movement.
Right. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of your story, Christian, is the music, is the role it played, because on the one hand, it was serving as a vehicle for hatred, but then it became sort of a unifying force. So what I want to ask you is, in your experience, what do you think it is about the power of music that can do that?
It's very interesting because that's certainly the truth. Music was something that brought me into the movement. When I started to listen to white power music for the first time at 14 years old, it kind of cast a spell over me. It was very, very enchanting, though it was kind of rough around the edges and violent. It spoke to me in a way that other music didn't, and I'd always loved music. But, prior to that, it was, bands like Duran Duran and The Outfield and U2 and things like that. Mm-hmm. And when I was introduced to this white power music, which was very much like punk rock, which I'd already been introduced to, the lyrics seemed important. The lyrics seemed to have an urgency, and it was a propaganda tool. It was very much an educational tool to convince young white people that they were being attacked. So music had a very heavy influence in bringing me into the movement. And for many years, it inspired me to go out and create bands to record racist music that would be used to recruit other white kids. Now, fast forward into my record store in 1995, which started to see the decline of my involvement in the movement. It was also music and conversations about music that wasn't white power music that kind of brought me back to humanity. It allowed me to connect with people who maybe I didn't have anything else in common with other than music. So we started to have these conversations around bands and around local music and around, types of music. And I started to really be connected to people because of that music. Fast forward even years later, after I left the movement, after I sold the store, after I decided I wanted to start talking about my past to help other people, I formed a music company, record label, and an artist management company where I dedicated myself to only supporting artists who were singing about positive things and seeing the impact that their music had on other people and how it built community, positive communities. the same way that the white power helped build a negative community, made me realize that the power of music is something that is very intrinsic in all of us. It's a very powerful medium. When we see young people who listen to a certain genre of music, whether it's heavy metal or whether it's hip hop, they tend to dress the same. They tend to act the same. They tend to use the same words and the same language. And that, to me, tells me that music is a really powerful tool to help build communities. And whether that's used for good or for bad is another story. But certainly music was a very common thread throughout my whole life, but more so throughout the existence of me being in the movement and helping me get out.
All right. So, Jordan, did you want to?
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, Chris, because the whole time I was thinking the same thing, like the punk rock connection, because I grew up like listening to punk rock music and hanging out with like punk rock people. And of course, like punk rock people associate themselves as skinheads, and that term is very vague and undefinable because they're not necessarily Nazis, but they do look a lot like Nazis, and they do act very aggressively, and they do have a bit of a uniform, and they're kind of pseudo-politically charged most of the time because of the music they listen to, and they're alcohol-fueled, of course.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction to make, too, and I'm glad you brought that up, is not all skinheads are racist skinheads. There are, skinhead is kind of a general term, kind of like, punk rock. There are different subgenres and subcultures within the skinhead movement. And most people would recognize the term skinhead as being associated to racism, where in fact it's not. There are many skinheads who are anti-racist skinheads and who actively fight racism. But because, neo-Nazi skinheads kind of get billed in the media, the term skinhead gets associated to them mostly. But I do want to make that distinction. Not all skinheads are evil, racist, neo-Nazi skinheads. There are many, many skinheads who have been fighting for equality and civil rights and support diversity for generations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, like this, it's interesting because you guys were all really young, probably getting into all this stuff, and it's a lot like, like music can be very, like, to young impressionable people, music can really change their course, really. I mean, like, it's not obviously forgivable, but like it does happen. But what I wanted to ask is, of course, about Amy Strickland and what happened to her, and how old were you when that happened?
I was close to 15 years old when the Amy Strickland attack happened, and actually that's the former member that I was talking about earlier, where several of the skinheads went to her apartment and beat her because they had seen her, or they had heard that she had been hanging around with people who they didn't want her to associate with. In this case, it was a black guy. And they went to her apartment and severely beat her and pistol whipped her and were arrested for that. They were also arrested at that time for going across Chicago and brutally damaging Jewish-owned stores and painting swastikas on synagogues on the 49th anniversary of the German Kristallnacht incident. And it was a turning point for me. I was too young at that point to be involved. I wasn't part of the intergroup, so I wasn't involved in that. But it was definitely something after the facts that inspired me, because I knew that these people meant business. I knew that they were serious about what they talked about. And, being 15 years old at the time, that inspired me not to necessarily go out and commit acts of violence, but to become more loyal to the organization that I saw as kind of a startup that had a lot of promise, because they were speaking about things that I thought other people were scared to talk about, where in fact other people weren't talking about it because they didn't agree with it. But the Amy Strickland incident was a pretty pivotal moment for me. One, because it incited me to become more involved, but also because it left me as the leader, because everybody who was associated with that case either went to prison, left the Chicago area, left the movement, grew their hair out, stayed under the radar, and it put me in a leadership position. So that was a pretty important catalyst, at least during those 7 years of my movement involvement.
I would imagine so. I was going to ask because of that, actually, because I do know that you were a appointed the head of that first neo-Nazi white power group in the U.S. after that incident. But you were 15 when you were appointed the leader. So what was the average age of people there? Were they older or younger than you?
Yeah, and it was, the age of 14, it was pretty critical to get young people associated with the movement, because it was a time when most young people are trying to develop their own identity, move away from their parents' influence, typically have some sort of a cause that they believe in strongly to fight for, and they're also rebellious at that age. So I would say during my time as a leader, most of the people were between the ages of 15 and 25. Certainly there were older people, and certainly there were, younger kids who hung around. But I also didn't become a leader, and I wasn't appointed a leader per se. I kind of inherited it because for lack of a better phrase, there really weren't any better options. There wasn't anybody who had been around long enough and who was savvy enough to kind of step into those shoes. And with everybody else in prison or gone, I was really left kind of holding the organization in my hands, and decided at that point that I was going to just step into those shoes without even being asked, and very quickly ramped up the group and got accolades from even the folks who had been in prison.
So as a leader of a group like this, what does that entail? I mean, like, do you have get-togethers and talk about like how much you guys all like Hitler, or how does that work?
Yeah, at that point, you're kind of like the cruise director, right? You're planning parties and get-togethers, mostly for recruiting purposes. You're directing what literature goes out as far as recruiting, or even for continuing education. And essentially put your group on the map. And for a lot of groups, that's, about causing violence. For us, while we did certainly have our fair share of violent fights and violent acts, our group, and I made a very concerted effort to do this, was more about marketing and recruiting, which is why I started the band. So I really saw our role as especially because we were in Chicago, at kind of the starting point for it all. I wanted to continue what I had been taught, and that was how to recruit more people. And eventually that turned into recruitment through music and recruitment through face-to-face contact by going to punk rock shows and kind of singling out the kids who you knew didn't have a whole lot to be proud of. So giving them something to be proud of was probably the most paramount thing that you could offer somebody who feels marginalized, is giving them something to believe in and giving them the power to now be individuals as part of a group with a larger mission. But I would say that the average age of people getting involved for the first time is somewhere between the age of 14 and 18, and they're continuing through that is typically through the ages of 25 to 30, where they either leave or they merge into other organizations. Sometimes it's a biker gang, sometimes it's a militia group, sometimes it's, nowadays it's organizations like the Tea Party, where you can still be, far right, conservative, political, and say essentially the same things that we used to say about immigrants and Jews and blacks and gays, without necessarily using derogatory terms. And unfortunately, that type of rhetoric, that type of watered-down racist rhetoric, appeals to many people who might otherwise be turned off by really over-the-top language or very aggressive tactics.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, it seems like, it's obviously such a foreign idea to me, but like the idea of recruiting, I'm doing like air quotes when I say that, but like recruiting people to join the group. It's like, you walk down the street and you'll see like, street preachers or whomever promoting their own various groups and beliefs and stuff like that. But it's like, how do you sell somebody on Nazism? That's just, it's so rotten to its core, right? You must take some serious convincing, or like, how does that work?
Well, we typically wouldn't lead with that. We wouldn't lead with the politics of it. An example of it would be to go stand outside of a punk rock show, stand there with a bunch of other scary-looking skinheads so that everybody recognizes why you're there. And you find the kid who is maybe getting picked on, or you can tell is, marginalized even from the group that he might be a part of, and striking up a conversation with that kid about, just like a friend would do, or an army recruiter might do, to just understand what makes that person tick a little bit more. Then you invite them to a party, and they start to feel the camaraderie. Of course, there's alcohol. Sometimes there were drugs. And there's definitely always music. And, suddenly that kid who felt like maybe he doesn't have a support system at home or friends suddenly is surrounded by people who seemingly care about him or her, who seemingly now can protect him or her from the outside influences that young person has been struggling with for years. So it's about really creating, a structure and a family atmosphere for people, throwing really, really great parties, and then, pulling them further in until the point where, there's a point of no return, when you start to introduce the politics more formally. And by that point, either the individual's got too much invested to walk away because they've got friends, they've now got protection. It's hard to walk away once you're in. Certainly a lot of people do, but the ones who end up staying are typically the ones that can be manipulated the most. So it's about manipulation. It's a bait and switch, essentially. You draw them in with the promise of paradise and the promise of support and the promise of family, and then you swap all that out with an ideology, and we were very successful at it. And I think a lot of groups, I don't think what we did is a different tactic than what a lot of other groups do. It could be an inner city street gang, or it could be ISIS, or it could be, any number of violent extremist or terrorist groups where, they really provide that friendship first, and then it turns into something a little bit more sinister.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course, we're dealing with young people, most of the time. We're not dealing with level-headed adults who've got decades of experience and wisdom. You're dealing with young people who want to do something that matters, who want to belong to something that's important, and they're brought in under the auspices of that, and then quickly the carpet is pulled out from under them. And while we never hid the fact that we were racist at the time, we also didn't lead with that. We knew that would turn a lot of people away, so we drew them in, and then kind of dropped the bomb on them after some time had passed.
Right, Christian. I know we touched on it before, and I mentioned that I want to return to it. How did you exactly become leader, and then how did things become different for you as an individual at that point?
I became a leader. It was really I was a victim of circumstance. Like I mentioned before, there were the group that I'd become involved in was called the Chicago Area Skinhead, and it was the first American neo-Nazi skinhead gang, and it was relatively small. I'd say probably 10 to 20 members at the time, and they were actively recruiting more young people like myself. So when I got involved, there were maybe 3 or 4 main figures, with Clark Martell being the most relevant leader in the organization. When Clark and many of the other leaders went to prison, I didn't really have a choice. I still wanted to belong. I was still very excited about being a part of it, and I didn't want to see it go away because it had become really important to me. It had become everything to me. It gave me the importance that I craved. So I wasn't going to let it go. And even at 15 years old and going on 16, I recognized that it was an entrepreneurial opportunity for me. I'd been raised in kind of an entrepreneurial family. My parents, when they came to the United States, opened a small beauty shop and ran it for many, many years. So I really didn't know much different than that. I always kind of endeavored to be, a business owner or a leader or an entrepreneur. So when I saw that void that was left by all the leaders of this organization when they went to prison or left the movement because of the Amy Strickland incident, I fell into it, but I also saw it as an opportunity to step in. So, being a young leader, there weren't a whole lot of people that were older than me that were still involved at that point. There was a lot of people who were roughly my age and younger. And by virtue of having been around the longest at that point, being the last man standing, it was very easy for me to step into that leadership role, and it was very natural for the people who had been recruited after me to look to me for leadership, because I was the last man standing, was kind of at the top by circumstance of everybody else just not being there anymore. And I didn't understand what it meant at that point. At that point, it was, again, another small circle of people that I quickly built up to, 40 or 50 people over, a year or two. It was very empowering for me to be in that position. It was very, I felt very natural at inspiring other people to go and do the things that I was passionate about. Mm-hmm. Not unlike selling, a salesman selling a product that he really believes in. If you believe in that product, you'll find a way for somebody else to fall in love with it as well. And I became very good at that. My approach was very, it was a very easy touch. It wasn't, an aggressive sell. And because I started to become popular, and because I used to be the marginalized kid who now wasn't anymore, kids saw that it was possible to kind of get out of their funk and be a part of something that would stop the bullying that had been happening to them. Mm-hmm. Or, maybe if they didn't have a family structure, if their parents, were divorced or were drug addicts or alcoholics, they found that family atmosphere with the skinhead group that I had built. It was also a really great social club. I mean, for a bunch of kids who, and I use great in the context of then, and not now, of course, but it was a place for young people to come together and feel like they had a voice, feel like they had a place, and feel like they had a mission going forward that was more important and bigger than them, and frankly more exciting and more interesting than the other things that were happening in kind of this lower middle class neighborhood, where a lot of their parents were out of work, and a lot of their parents were drug addicts and alcoholics, and a lot of their parents were divorced. So it was really easy for me to provide that family atmosphere and that social excitement to them. And because I was able to do that, my leadership status and just my status in general grew very, very quickly.
Right. Now, Christian, I know that word hatred gets thrown around quite easily today when people are talking about things as, mundane as, I hate this TV show, or I hate when this commercial comes on. But in your case, obviously, you experienced the most extreme kind of hatred. How would you describe, the subjective dimension of that? Like, what is going through your head? How are you feeling on a day-to-day basis? Such a hard thing for most people to ever relate to because they never get there. Sure. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like?
Yeah, hatred is a very powerful word that I think we use very loosely in a lot of cases, and when it's warranted, it sometimes loses its impact. For me, having left the movement 20 years ago and having worked to further equality and diversity and help end the racism that I helped create, I planted many, many seeds over 20 years ago that are still sprouting today. Anytime we see or hear on the news of somebody, walking into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdering 9 people, or walking into a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and murdering 5 innocent people, or the vast number of other stories that get buried in the news cycle after maybe a day. I feel very responsible for that indirectly. There were so many seeds that I planted years ago that I know that exponentially those weeds began to sprout all over the world. And every time I see it, I've dedicated myself to kind of pulling those weeds out. So, I've spent the last 20 years of my life contemplating the 7 years that I was involved in the movement. And, I had 2 realizations from that time for those 20 years where I've had to think about it. One, I wanted to educate people because I believe that hatred and racism is based on ignorance. Ignorance breeds fear. Fear, when unmanaged, can potentially manifest as violence. So I've dedicated the last 20 years of my life to helping educate people about our differences so that they're unafraid of those differences, so that fear and that ignorance doesn't turn into something more violent. 5 years ago, in 2010, I co-founded an organization called Life After Hate. It's a nonprofit group based in Chicago, but we're an international organization that helps to educate people by developing curriculum for young students about diversity. We also have public service announcements that are targeted towards people who are either in hate groups or may know family members or friends who are part of these hate movements who want help getting out. So essentially, we are creating a pathway for people to leave these extremist hate groups by providing services, by providing mentorship, by providing potentially, through our partners, things like job training or mental health counseling or tattoo removal, which are typically the obstacles for people to see success and to feel happiness. Because let's face it, happy people don't behead other people. Happy people don't plant bombs. Happy people don't walk in to a Planned Parenthood facility and murder people. It's only people who have something missing in their life, so much so that they've turned now to something that's hateful and violent. So my goal is to help provide people who are stuck in those movements with pathways to get out, to make themselves better people so that they don't need the crutch of the ideology and the negative community that they've built around themselves. I want to kind of supplant that with a more positive environment and, support network. Because when I left, there wasn't a support network. In 1995, when I decided to leave the movement because, I had started to build relationships with people who I could no longer call my enemies, and I had children, and when I held my child for the first time in my arms, I suddenly reconnected with my own innocence prior to 14. I realized I just couldn't do it anymore, that the ideology was flawed, it didn't make sense, and it couldn't be possible in a world that we live in. And it was a completely misguided thing for 7 years that I suddenly had an awakening and said, I'm unhappy. That's why I'm doing those things. And because I'm not talking about it, even though I'd left the movement for several years, when I didn't talk about my past and I tried to outrun it, I still wasn't healing. So when I decided to start to talk about my past to help educate other people and show them a glimpse of how easy it is, and provide a cautionary tale of how simple it is for a young person who's looking to do something that matters to be co-opted by negative groups who are preaching hate and violence, that's when everything clicked for me. That's when I decided I wanted to help other people. So we've launched the nonprofit called Life After Hate, which is made up of all former far-right extremists who've gone on to do really amazing things with their lives and are very committed to helping others get out of that lifestyle. And then I wrote my book, and my book was simply a way for me to tell people how easy it is to go down a wrong path and to be very careful about surrounding yourself with people, unless they're people who want to foster your positivity and help you down a positive path. So I think, it's inspired me to help people, and hopefully, people will have access to the opportunity and the resources that they need so that they don't go down the same path that I did.
Sure. And Christian, I think it's a fantastic turn to your story that you started Life After Hate, and you're offering those pathways. I'm wondering, Christian, whether you're still dealing with any kind of stigma because people know that you were part of that group, and how that's been like for you.
For the first decade after I left, which it's been 20 years since I left, for the first decade that I left, for that first 5 years of that decade, I didn't talk about who I was. I thought that if I just made new friends and moved and started a new social circle, that I would never have to talk about what I was involved in, that I could outrun it. In fact, that was probably one of the worst things that I decided to do because I still had not healed because I had not talked publicly about what I'd been through. And also during that time, there were a lot of people who didn't believe my transformation, and partly because I didn't talk about it. I didn't face it head on. Since then, for the greater part of 10 years and maybe even closer to 15 years, I've been very active in condemning what I was involved in, and also very active in helping rebuild, a sense of equality and diversity with all the people that I work with. So I certainly don't get that anymore. While I don't doubt that there are, the stragglers out there who, may or may not be supportive of what I do now, I certainly don't hear about it. What I do hear a lot about is, the tremendous amount of help that our organization gives to people who feel stuck, about the great work and dedication that our people do at Life After Hate to work with these people who are not always in the best situation and need, very close attention to care after they've left, because essentially what we're doing is we're becoming the next gang for them to join, right?
Mm-hmm.
The benevolent gang.
Right.
And I hate to use that word, but a lot of people who are involved in these groups typically are involved because they're so attracted to that social lifestyle, many times negative, that they need to transition from something that they've been fascinated by to something else that is also a group structure. And our group structure is one that's completely based on compassion and empathy and acceptance of diversity and understanding of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think what I've done over the last 20 years speaks for itself, and I hardly ever, if any, time hear about anybody who's a detractor to what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Although there are many people who are in the movement that certainly don't wish me well and have published my phone number and home address online and things like that. But that would seem to be one step ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's fascinating, actually, that you bring that up, because your book that you released this year, Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead, it's got, for the most part, pretty good reviews, but it's funny because on Amazon, I think you're right, there's some people that are still part of the movement, like the Nazi movement, they're the ones that are angry with you now. And there's one guy is saying here that they're saying they never thought that you would turn your back so hard on the group. And this person is a fan of the band Way that you were the front man of, right? Way stands for White American Youth.
Yep. Yeah, and I wouldn't expect them to all agree with the message, because the message of the book is, it's one of compassion and empathy and change, and showing that change is possible, but also, teaching through my experiences what led to me getting involved and what instances led to me getting out. And, to them, I'm a traitor, and to them, I'm probably at the top of their list of people who they wish weren't on this planet anymore. And, that happened. I guess I wrote the right thing to keep them angry. The book is certainly not a tell-all book. In fact, it's not a tell-all at all. If anything, it's a tell-all book about me and my life and me exposing, my weaknesses and my emotions during that time and after. But yeah, no, I fully expected that there was going to be a lot of folks who were still involved in the movement who wouldn't necessarily like the idea of my book. But on the flip side, I've gotten tremendous, support from people who feel like the book has changed their lives and, have opened their eyes to something that they knew existed but weren't really familiar with, and certainly weren't as familiar with how entrenched in American society that racism is, and from all walks of life. And these are young people and older people and educators and hopefully the book has done some good to help people so that they can relate with my story, so that they can find a way out of their current narrative.
It's fantastic. So so that book is available on Amazon and pretty much anywhere where books are sold, right?
Yeah, you can also go to romanticviolence.com, and there is a list of and links to places where the book can be purchased. You can also walk into your local bookstore and request a copy of it, and they should be able to order it for you. Otherwise, Amazon is typically the easiest place for people to find it. And the book is called Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead.
Right. And Christian, where can people find out more about Life After Hate?
the easiest way is to go to lifeafterhate.org,
Mm-hmm.
and you can find out about our services there, about what we do. And we also just launched a program called Exit USA that is an actual anonymous helpline for people who feel stuck in hate groups who want help getting out. We've been very successful since we've soft launched that earlier this year with people who've reached out to us with amazing, sometimes really amazing stories of their own transformation that they've undergone completely independently, and are now part of our support network for people who want to get out. So change is possible, and it does happen, and there are some really amazing people who once subscribed to some pretty hateful ideologies who are doing amazing things to help people in need and to help make the world a better place for everybody.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, I'd like to thank you personally, Christian, for your time and enlightening us today and sharing with us your remarkable story.
It's my pleasure, Paul Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite the conversation there. It's really weird, huh? I mean, going from that end of the spectrum to basically the complete polar opposite.
Absolutely. And I feel it's an inspirational tale because whether we're talking about an individual like himself who descended into that level of hatred or someone else who's in a really dark place, it gives hope that people can change, that given the right opportunity, the right surroundings, people not giving up on them, they can change and change for the better and try and correct the wrongs they did. I mean, he was talking about the legacy that he feels he's left of hatred that he's trying to reverse right now. So I was happy to hear that, but it's amazing that I still feel it's amazing that, you know, there was ever that time in his life where just in virtue of being a human being that he was so full of rage and hatred that he couldn't see otherwise. Just because we live in a human community, a society where there's people of all walks of life around us, and you would think that when we're exposed to that, we don't become so, engulfed with hatred and things that prevent us from seeing people as who they are, which is just people. But at that point of his life, he did.
I think that, it's really interesting to hear him say that it's all these sort of, adolescents and youths that were involved in that. And I'm sure there still are, Nazi groups and probably the same age demographics subscribe to those. But it's interesting to me because kids are stupid. We all know that. Mm-hmm. And I think that in this case, though, it's particularly interesting because I kind of went in not knowing too much about who Christian is today, and what his accomplishments are. And I think that to a large degree, I was a little bit not super into the idea of this guy because of the fact that his most recent claim to fame is the publication of a book about being a reformed neo-Nazi. Mm-hmm. And I see this all the time, right? It's like people do a lot of drugs and then they go to rehab and then it's celebrated that they got sober in the end. It's like, but you did something that wasn't viewed generally as a good thing, and then you changed your ways, so now you're being celebrated. It doesn't always necessarily feel that sort of celebration is merited by just doing something bad and then stopping it.
Right.
But he does seem like he's in a legitimate place of peace right now, which is really positive. And also, I mean, I had no idea about his musical connections and the network and whatnot.
Well, it is really interesting. I mean, it testifies to the power of music, that what got him into neo-Nazism, or what was a big part of it, is the same force that has turned him around. You know, he started that music store, and it was music at first was a vehicle for him to promote hatred and to recruit people to hate, but now it's become this sort of meeting point of different people who are coming together to be who they are, you know, to whatever their race, ethnicity, and so he's now been able to kind of, I guess, use it for its positive purposes. But it's, I guess, I wonder, I mean, whether it's like, to me, that kind of hatred to me is almost on par with a kind of trauma. So I wonder whether someone who descends that far into the hell of hatred is ever fully, I didn't quite feel comfortable asking him that question, to be honest, you know, whether he's fully rid of hatred. Because, I mean, ideally that's exactly what you want, and that's why the book is being celebrated. But I hope that he has turned the leaf. I guess that's one final thought for me, that he has fully turned the leaf, and that hatred has disappeared entirely. Because we're not talking about, you know, just like a change of preference. You know, we're talking about a very deep-seated hatred, and I guess, I mean, time will tell. But like you, I feel that he is genuine. But yeah, that's my only lingering thought.
Yeah, well, hopefully it is genuine, and hopefully his positivity doesn't wane.
Yeah, absolutely. Next week we're interviewing Missy.
Barbara Green. Wait,
No.
are we interviewing next week?
So I scheduled Miss C Suicide.
Missy Sue. We were doing the interview with Barbara Green the next podcast. You already booked it?
Yeah.
What are we gonna do?
So we could do both, I think.
Do two
I think it'd
podcasts.
be okay if we do both. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, you heard it here. 2 podcasts coming up next week.
So that's right. We got then Missy Suicide and Barbara Green.
Until then.
This is the Dark Room.